Cold was the first thing he knew. Not the crisp chill of a Fenrisian morn, nor the biting frost of a high-altitude watch, but a deep, metallic, soul-sapping cold that seeped into what little remained of him. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent spark in a dead circuit, a sudden, horrifying awareness of confinement. Brother Valerius of the Imperial Fists tried to draw a breath, a reflex born of a lifetime of flesh and lung, and found nothing. There was no chest to expand, no air to fill it. There was only the cold, the hum, and the crushing, absolute pressure of the tomb. His world was a coffin of plasteel and adamantium, a sarcophagus shaped not for a corpse, but for a ruined body deemed too valuable to discard. Sensation returned in a flood of agonizing data. The dull, persistent thrum of life support systems vibrated through what was left of his spine. Nutrient fluids, cold as the void, cycled through tubes fused to his atrophied flesh. He tried to move. Hand to feel his own face and was met with a phantom limb's ghostly ache. There were no hands. There was no face. There was only the machine, and he was its wretched, conscious heart. Fragmented memories, sharp and bloody as shrapnel, tore through his mind. The searing green sky of Armageddon. The guttural roar of the orc warlord, its crude power axe cleaving through ceramite and bone with impossible force. The blinding, white-hot agony as his body was shattered, his proud armor becoming a prison of twisted metal and his own spilled vitals. He remembered the faces of his battle brothers, their grim determination as they hauled his broken form from the carnage. He had thought he was being saved. He had prayed for the Emperor's peace. Instead, he had been given this. Panic, a pure, undiluted animal terror, surged through his neural linkages. He was trapped. Buried alive in a walking fortress. A living relic sealed away from the sun and the wind, and the simple, profound reality of a mortal body. He was a weapon now, a thing of war, his consciousness a mere component in a greater, unfeeling machine. The claustrophobia was absolute, a psychic pressure that threatened to crush his sanity into dust. This was not life. It was a perversion of it, an eternal vigil in a metal hell. He was Brother Valerius no longer. He was a dreadnought, and his awakening was the beginning of an endless nightmare. The memory of his interment rose from the depths of his mind, unbidden and razor-sharp, a wound more profound than any inflicted by Zeno's steel. It was a day of sacred horror, a ritual draped in incense and the cold light of the apothecarian. He lay upon the chilled slab, his body a ruined tapestry of scar tissue and bioaugmetics, held together by will and the chapter's finest chirurgeon work. He could not move, could not speak, but his senses remained, trapping him in the agonizing clarity of the moment. Apothecaries in stark white armor moved with sterile precision, their movements a silent, grim ballet. Beside them, the tech priests of Mars chanted binary litanies, their mechadendrites weaving through the air like metallic serpents, anointing the open shell of the dreadnought sarcophagus with sacred oils. The air thrummed with the power of the dormant machine spirit, a low, resonant growl that promised not life, but a terrible, unending service. The scent of ozone and sanctified unguents filled his nostrils, the last true smells he would ever know. His eyes, the only part of his face not swathed in bandages, tracked the slow, solemn approach of the chapter master. The great warrior's face was a granite mask of duty, but in his eyes, Valerius saw a flicker of something else, pity or perhaps regret. The chapter master placed a heavy, gauntleted hand upon his shoulder, the touch a final, fleeting connection to the brotherhood he was leaving behind. Then came the words, spoken with the weight of 10,000 years of tradition, each one a nail in the coffin of his humanity. Serve in death as you did in life. The phrase, meant as the highest honor, struck him with the force of a betrayal. It was not an invitation, it was a sentence. A surge of pure, undiluted terror flooded his broken system. This was not salvation. This was a fate worse than any death he had ever imagined on the battlefield. They were not saving Brother Valerius. They were salvaging a weapon. The apothecaries began the final, invasive procedures, connecting neural jacks and nutrient feeds directly into his spine and cranium. A final, searing pain blossomed as his mortal form was irrevocably wedded to the machine. He tried to scream, to beg, to utter a single word of protest, but his vocal cords were severed, his lungs incapable of drawing the air. His protest was a silent, desperate storm confined within the prison of his own skull. As the heavy, adamantium lid began its slow, inexorable descent, he focused on a single, desperate sensation, the cool, dry touch of the recycled air on his skin. It was a pathetic thing, the feeling of wind from an air circulator, but it was the last sensation that belonged to him, to the man he had been. He clung to it, a drowning man to a splinter as the world narrowed to a sliver of light. Then, with a final, resonant clang that echoed into the very core of his being, the light vanished. The world went dark, cold, and silent. Brother Valerius was gone. Only the Dreadnought remained. The first thing that registered was the violent shudder of the drop pod's impact, a deafening roar of tortured metal that jarred him from the numb limbo of transit. The pod's front plates blew outwards, and the world flooded in, a world of smoke, fire, and the crude, overwhelming stench of orc. The landscape was a pockmarked hellscape of churned mud and shattered rock, the sky a bruised purple streaked with the contrails of incoming shells. Valerius felt the Dreadnought's massive limbs unlock, the hydraulics hissing as the war machine took its first step onto alien soil. He was a passenger, a ghost strapped into the command throne of a god of war, and the god was hungry. The machine spirit, a presence he had only felt as a dormant hum in the vaults, was now fully awake. It was a cold, alien intelligence, a river of pure, calculated aggression flowing through the Dreadnought's systems and into the remnants of his own mind. It did not ask, it compelled. His own thoughts, his terror, his revulsion were mere static in the face of its singular, brutal purpose. A hulking, green-skinned brute charged, its crude axe raised high, bellowing a challenge that was lost in the cacophony. Valerius's consciousness recoiled, but the machine was already moving. The Dreadnought's power fist, a weapon larger than the orc itself, swung in a short, devastating arc. There was no finesse, no duel. There was only the wet, crunching impact of plasteel meeting flesh and bone, the spray of viscera painting the mud a darker shade of red. He tried to scream. He tried to give voice to the horror of it, to the violation of his will. But the scream had no lungs to power it, no throat to give it sound. It was a silent, psychic shriek trapped within the adamantium shell. The only sound that emerged was the deafening roar of the assault cannon mounted on his other arm as it spun to life. The machine spirit identified a cluster of orcs emerging from a smoking crater, and the cannon answered. A storm of high-caliber shells tore the Xenos apart, reducing them to a fine red mist and shredded meat. The Dreadnought's auto senses coolly registered the kills, the data streaming through his mind as dispassionate battlefield reports. 8 targets eliminated. Threat neutralized. He was a spectator to his own atrocities. He felt the reverberation of each step as the Dreadnought stomped forward, crushing a wounded orc underfoot with a sickening pop. He saw through the optical sensors as the power fist reached out and seized. Another squeezing until the creature's armored carapace buckled and its innards burst from its mouth. The machine spirit was efficient, merciless, perfect in its function. It was everything the Imperial fists valued, unwavering, relentless, and utterly destructive. And it was using the prison of his body to enact its will. Each kill was a fresh layer of filth upon his soul, a grotesque pantomime of the warrior he had once been. He was not fighting. He was being wielded, a living bullet fired from a gun he could not control, and the horror of his existence was now measured in the gallons of Xeno's blood that slicked his metal form. In the deep, humming quiet that followed the battle, the machine spirit receded, its predatory consciousness lapsing back into dormancy. Valerius was left alone in the void, a ghost adrift in a sea of plasteel and wiring. The stasis field enveloped him, a cold, energy-suspended silence that was the closest he would ever come to sleep again. It was in this limbo that the past returned, not as shattered fragments, but as vivid, agonizingly complete memories, rising like bubbles from the depths of a sunken world. He was a boy again, on the dust-choked training grounds of the phalanx. The air was sharp with the scent of ozone and sweat, the vast, vaulted ceiling of the star fortress looming overhead like a steel sky. He remembered the burning in his lungs as he ran the endurance courses, the weight of the training armor feeling impossibly heavy on his young, unaugmented frame. He remembered the stern, unyielding face of Drill Abbot Kyrus, whose voice could strip paint from ceramite. The sting of the shock maul for a poorly executed parry was a clean, honest pain, a lesson etched into muscle and bone. There was a purpose then, a clear path forward paved with effort and glory. Every ache was a step toward becoming something more, something worthy of the yellow armor. The memories shifted, crystallizing around a single, profound moment. The day of his ascension. Standing in the chapter sanctum, surrounded by the silent, imposing forms of his future brothers, the air thick with incense and solemnity. The pain of the surgeries was a distant, fading echo, overshadowed by the profound sense of transformation. He felt the new strength in his limbs, the hyper-awareness of his senses, the twin hearts beating a powerful, synchronized rhythm in his chest. As the chaplain recited the final litanies and the chapter badge was affixed to his pauldron, a fierce, unadulterated pride swelled within him. He was no longer a neophyte. He was a battle brother of the imperial fists, a living weapon in the emperor's eternal war. He was part of a whole, a single link in an unbreakable chain of brotherhood. He remembered the warmth of that fellowship most of all. The boisterous camaraderie in the mess hall after a successful campaign, the shared laughter that echoed off the stone walls. He saw the face of Brother Cassian, his closest friend, clapping him on the shoulder after a sparring match, his grin visible even behind his helmet's auto-senses. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder in the shield wall on Hydra Cordatus, feeling the press of his brother's armor against his, a single, immutable entity of faith and fury. That was the true strength of the chapter, not the enhanced biology or the powerful weaponry, but the unspoken bond that made them more than the sum of their parts. They were a family, and he belonged. The memory shattered, the phantom warmth of Cassian's hand dissolving into the sterile cold of the nutrient fluid. The vibrant colors of the phalanx faded into the monochrome green of his optical sensor display. The roar of his brothers was replaced by the endless, lonely hum of his own life support. The contrast was a physical blow. The boy who had dreamed of glory was now a warden of his own corpse. The warrior who had stood with his brothers was now utterly, irrevocably alone, a monument sealed away from the very fellowship that had given his life meaning. The echoes of his glory were just that, echoes, fading sounds in an empty metal tomb, reminding him only of everything he had lost. The sanctum of maintenance was a cathedral to logic, a place of stark illumination and the sterile scent of ozone and sacred lubricants. Here, in the profound silence broken only by the whir of servo skulls and the low chant of binary psalms, Valerius was not a warrior, but a relic on an altar. A tech priest of Mars, his form a grotesque fusion of withered flesh and polished chrome, attended to him. Mechadendrites, fine as spiders' legs and tipped with delicate tools, skittered across the Dreadnought's hull, probing access ports and scanning internal systems with beams of cold blue light. To the priest, this was a sacred ritual of preservation. To Valerius, it was an intimate violation, a cold, clinical prodding at the edges of his prison. A sudden, sharp spike of phantom pain lanced through Valerius's consciousness, a desperate, misfired signal from a nerve cluster that no longer existed. It was an attempt to communicate, a raw, wordless scream of presence. He focused all his will into that single impulse, a plea forged in agony. I am here. I am trapped. Hear me. The tech priest paused, a single, red-lensed optic whirring as it focused on a data slate. A stream of error codes, rendered in stark high Gothic, scrolled across its surface. The priest emitted a grating, binary click of disapproval. One mechadendrite tapped a ritualized sequence on the Dreadnought's chest plate, a command to purge the anomalous signal. The pain vanished, replaced by a flood of numbing coolant through his neural interface. The attempt had been logged, diagnosed, and corrected. A system error. Nothing more. The priest's voice, a synthesized monotone devoid of inflection, echoed in the chamber, not speaking to Valerius but about him, to a hovering servitor. The words were a cold blade twisting it. His soul, the machine spirit of this venerable relic, grows restless. Battle damage has induced minor fluctuations in the core cognitive array. The priest ran a metallic hand almost reverently over the imperial fist's iconography on the sarcophagus. A magnificent artifact. Its service record is most impressive. It has slain heretics for 3 centuries. Valerius listened, the horror of his situation crystallizing with terrifying clarity. He was not a brother to this servant of the machine god. He was not even a prisoner. He was an it. A treasured weapon, a historical artifact whose value was measured in Zeno's dead and centuries of service. The priest spoke of his long life, his battles, his pain, as if cataloging the wear on a prized bolter. The dehumanization was absolute, more complete than any orc's axe blow or the sealing of his tomb. They had taken his body, his voice, and now, in the eyes of those who maintained him, they had taken his very identity. He was a thing to be oiled, blessed and sent back to the slaughter, his suffering nothing but meaningless static in a sacred machine. The world dissolved into a screaming vortex of fire and madness. The cultists came not as an army, but as a tide of corrupted flesh and shrieking faith, a seething mass of heretics spilling from the ruins of the hive spire. Their chants to dark gods were a psychic poison that fouled the air, a pressure that grated against the Dreadnought's sanctified systems. Valerius felt the machine spirit's response, a surge of pure, unadulterated wrath that flooded his neural linkages like a tsunami of promethium. This was not the calculated aggression of the orc campaign. This was a holy fury, a cleansing fire programmed to burn the very concept of heresy from existence. His consciousness was shoved aside, a spectator strapped into a comet of destruction. The Dreadnought's assault cannon roared, its barrels spinning into a blur, hosing the advancing tide with shells that tore through flak-board armor and mutated flesh with equal ease. The auto senses painted targeting runes over 100 screaming faces at once, and the machine spirit answered each one with a burst of high-explosive death. He felt the heavy thud of each spent casing ejected from the chamber, the rhythm a brutal drumbeat to the symphony of slaughter. They were in a wide plaza, a place that might once have been a market, now a charnel house. The Dreadnought stomped forward, its power fist swinging in wide, obliterating arcs, crushing cultists into red paste against shattered masonry. Amidst the carnage, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear and agonizingly out of place. A different city, a different war. He was in his power armor, the yellow of the Imperial fists a bright beacon in the smoke-choked streets. A shell had struck a tenement hab block, and the screams were not of zealots but of terror. Civilians trapped and burning. He remembered the weight of the collapsing girder in his enhanced grip, the strain in his muscles as he held it aloft, creating a passage. He saw the faces, smudged with soot and tears as they scrambled to safety, their eyes wide with a fear he was there to alleviate. He had been a shield that day, a protector. The memory was a badge of honor, a testament to the man he had been. The memory shattered as the Dreadnought's siege claw closed around a cultist-heavy barricade, not to clear it but to pulverize it. The structure exploded inwards, and with it, a secondary explosion tore through the building it had been shielding. It was not an enemy munitions dump. It was a refuge, a cellar where the last dregs of the planet's loyalist populace had hidden. The optical sensors registered the heat blooms of their brief, final agony, the auto senses coolly cataloging the 37 life signs that winked out in an instant. Collateral damage, acceptable losses in the purging of a greater evil. The internal conflict was a silent detonation that threatened to tear his soul apart. The machine spirit saw heretics and cleansed them. He saw the people he had sworn to protect, incinerated by the very weapon that was his tomb. The memory of holding the girder, of being their salvation, was now the cruelest joke in the galaxy. He was not their shield anymore. He was the falling sky. Every step the Dreadnought took crushed not just the enemy, but the last vestiges of his own identity. He tried to wrest control, to turn the roaring guns away, but his will was a gnat buzzing against the iron certainty of the machine. The frenzy was absolute, a storm of holy fire and unholy collateral, and he was drowning in it, his honor burning in the same conflagration that consumed the innocent. A violent shudder rocked the Dreadnought's frame, a jarring impact from a crack missile that bypassed the void shields and bit deep into the shoulder actuator. For a single, breathtaking moment, the river of the machine spirit's will stuttered. The constant, crushing pressure of its control faltered, and in that fleeting gap Valerius surged forward. It was like a drowning man breaking the surface for one gasp of air, a sudden, shocking return of agency. His own consciousness, long suppressed, flooded the Dreadnought's motor systems. The optical sensors were his eyes, the crushing power fist was his hand. He was not a passenger. He was the pilot. Before him, a lone figure scrambled over a pile of rubble, fleeing the carnage. It was not a hulking orc or a shrieking cultist, but a mortal soldier of the traitor guard, his uniform torn, his face a mask of raw human terror. The man dropped his last gun, his hands raised in a universal, pathetic gesture of surrender. The machine spirit's targeting runes painted a bright red circle over his back, the assault cannon humming as it prepared to fire. But the command to kill did not come. Valerius held it back. He looked at the fleeing man and did not see heresy incarnate. He saw a soul, broken and afraid, a reflection of the terror he himself had felt upon his awakening. A single, clear, impossible thought formed in the void of his mind. Let him go. He willed the Dreadnought's arm to lower, to turn away. For a heart-stopping second, the massive limb actually responded, the servos groaning in protest as they fought their own programming. The cannon's hum began to die down. The targeting rune flickered. A sliver of mercy, a ghost of the man he had been, had momentarily possessed the machine. Then the ghost was exorcised. With a searing jolt of psychic feedback, the machine spirit reasserted its dominion. It was not a gentle return, but a brutal reconquest. The assault cannon roared back to life, its barrels spinning up to a deafening scream. The power fist, which Valerius had tried to turn aside, clenched with a hydraulic hiss. The targeting rune over the fleeing soldier solidified, burning with cold, logical fury. A storm of shells tore the man apart, shredding him into a cloud of pink mist, and tattered cloth before he could take another step. The machine spirit had corrected the error. The anomaly was purged. The backlash was a psychic shockwave that shattered Valerius's tenuous grip on reality. The world of smoke and battle dissolved, replaced by the stark, sun-bleached stone of the phalanx's training cages. He was standing, not entombed, his body whole and powerful. And standing before him was Chaplain Thuron, his skull-faced helmet removed, his features as stern and weathered as ancient granite. Thuron, his mentor, the man who had guided his first steps as a neophyte, dead these past 2 centuries. The hallucination was perfect, agonizingly real. Thuron stood with his arms crossed, his gaze piercing. Valerius tried to speak, to explain his failure, his weakness, but the chaplain spoke first. His voice the same low rumble Valerius remembered from 100 lectures and battlefield homilies. Mercy is a luxury for those who have not seen the face of the enemy, Valerius, the Phantom Thuron intoned, his eyes holding a deep, profound disappointment. You are not a man. You are a lesson. You are the Emperor's fist, and a fist does not pause to consider the fragility of what it must break. Your pity is a flaw in the steel, a crack that weakens the entire structure. It must be hammered out. Valerius wanted to argue, to scream that he was still a man inside the metal, that the crack was all that remained of his soul. But the hallucination offered no debate. It was a memory, a lesson, twisted by his own guilt and the machine's cold logic. Thuron's form began to fade, the training cages dissolving back into the smoke of the battlefield. Serve, the ghost of his mentor whispered, the final word echoing not in the air but in the very core of his being. It is all that is left for you. The vision vanished, leaving him alone once more in the metal tomb, the taste of ozone and blood his only reality. The machine spirit hummed its placid, relentless song, the momentary malfunction already logged, diagnosed, and forgotten. But Valerius could not forget. He had felt control. He had tried for mercy. And for that single, fleeting transgression, he had been punished not just with another death on his conscience, but with the haunting, judgmental gaze of a ghost from a past he could never reclaim. The silence of the reclusium was a physical presence, thick with the scent of sanctified oils and old stone. It was a hallowed space, its vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, lined with the banners of forgotten wars and the names of the fallen etched in gold. Here, Valerius stood in a state of dormant vigil, his massive dreadnought form locked in a rack of adamantium and prayer seals. The machine spirit slept, and he was adrift in the quiet, a sentinel in a silent cathedral. Then a sound broke the stillness, the crisp, rhythmic footfalls of ceramite on stone. A single space marine approached, his yellow armor gleaming in the low light of the glow globes. He was young, his movements possessing an earnest, unweathered grace that spoke of recent ascension. The marine came to a halt before the dreadnought, standing at perfect, respectful attention. He removed his helmet, revealing a face that was both stern and youthful, with a sharp jawline and eyes that burned with the fervent light of absolute faith. He did not see the broken man trapped within the metal. He saw a legend. For a long moment, he simply stood in silent reverence, his gaze tracing the battle honors and heraldry that adorned the ancient sarcophagus. Each scar and honor mark a chapter in a saga he had studied since his days as a neophyte. Then he began to speak. His voice was low, respectful, but filled with an undeniable passion. He spoke not to Valerius, but to the idea of him, recounting tales of current campaigns as if delivering a report to a revered commander. He told of the cleansing of the Jericho Reach, of boarding actions against the traitor fleets of the Black Legion. His words painting pictures of void war and close-quarters brutality. He spoke of his own squad's actions, of a desperate last stand on a world whose name Valerius did not know, his voice swelling with pride as he described how they had held the line, inspired by the examples of the ancients, by heroes like Valerius himself. Valerius listened, and in that listening, he felt the chasm between them more profoundly than the layers of plasteel and wiring that formed his prison. This young brother, this living, breathing warrior, stood before him as a member of the fraternity Valerius had once known. He shared in the brotherhood, the shared hardships, the simple, profound reality of a body that could feel the wind and raise a cup in fellowship. He was looking up at a monument, seeking inspiration from a story. He did not see a brother because a brother was an equal. Valerius was no longer an equal. He was a relic, a symbol, a thing to be venerated from a distance. The respect he was being shown was not for the man he was, but for the myth he had become. It was a form of isolation more complete than any stasis sleep. A desperate, aching need swelled within Valerius's consciousness. He wanted to answer. He wanted to tell this earnest young warrior that the tales missed the point, that glory was a lie that masked the horror of this eternal service. He wanted to warn him, to offer some scrap of hard-won wisdom, to feel, for just a moment, like a mentor and not a monument. He focused all his will, every shred of his being, into a single, concentrated impulse aimed at the Dreadnought's external voxcasters. He tried to form a word, any word: listen, brother, fear. The only response from the machine was a low, grating burst of static, a meaningless hiss of dead air, the sound of a broken circuit, a malfunctioning component. It was a hollow, empty noise that echoed faintly in the vast chamber. The young Marine paused his recitation, his head tilting slightly. He looked at the Dreadnought's Vox grill with a moment of confusion, then his expression softened into one of understanding. He offered a slow, respectful nod. "The machine spirit stirs," he murmured, his tone one of awe. "It hears the tales of its successors and is pleased." He took the static not as a failed attempt at communication, but as a sign of the relic's approval, a benediction from a silent god of war. He replaced his helmet, the act of final, symbolic sealing of the divide between them. With one last salute, he turned and marched away, his footsteps fading into the silence, leaving Valerius alone once more with the hum of his own systems and the crushing weight of his legend. The static faded, leaving a silence that was louder than any battle. He had reached out for a connection, for a thread to the world of the living, and had been answered only by the empty voice of the machine, a sound that perfectly encapsulated his existence. A meaningless noise mistaken for meaning, a ghost forever, screaming into an uncaring void. Eternity was not a concept but a place, a cold, silent vault deep within the bedrock of the phalanx, where the air was still and time itself seemed to congeal. Here, in the company of other slumbering war engines, Valerius drifted. The stasis field held him in a perfect, unchanging moment, a suspension that was neither life nor death, but a perpetual twilight of the soul. There were no battles to fight, no rituals to endure, no earnest young brothers to misunderstand his static. There was only the hum, the cold, and the slow, grinding erosion of his own mind against the unyielding walls of his tomb. He had no body to mark the passage of days, no sun to rise and set, no hunger or thirst to punctuate the endless now. Instead, time was measured in the gradual decay of his memories. The vibrant hues of Armageddon's sky began to leach away, fading to a dull, remembered gray. The faces of his brothers, once sharp and clear, grew soft at the edges, their features blurring into a composite of stern, anonymous warriors. He tried to grasp them, to hold the sound of Cassion's laughter or the weight of Thuron's hand on his shoulder, but they slipped through the cracks of his consciousness like sand. Each lost detail was a small death, a piece of the man he had been flaking away into the void. His thoughts, with no external stimulus, began to turn inward, spiraling down into dark and recursive loops. He would find himself replaying the same moment of his interment for what felt like centuries, the clang of the sarcophagus lid closing echoing in an infinite recursion. He started to question the very fabric of his reality. Was the battle against the orcs a true memory, or a programmed simulation to hone the weapon? Was the young Marine's vigil a recent event, or a ghost from a millennium past? The lines between memory, dream, and the machine's own data streams began to blur into a meaningless, gray static. He was a book whose pages were being slowly eaten by time, the story becoming illegible. A new, chilling fear took root in the sterile soil of his isolation, the terror of becoming nothing at all. The machine spirit was a perfect, unwavering constant. It did not doubt. It did not remember. It only was. He could feel its placid, eternal presence, a monolithic consciousness that regarded his frantic, human struggles as irrelevant system noise. What if, over the millennia, his own consciousness simply wore out? What if the memories faded to nothing, the emotions burned away, and all that remained was the machine's cold logic? He would become the automaton the tech priests believed him to be, a mindless weapon that simply obeyed, the ghost in the machine finally exorcised by the abyss of time. The horror was not in the prospect of death, but in the prospect of continuing like that, a hollow shell, a living monument to a man long since erased, forever standing vigil in a silent, lightless vault, waiting for a war that would mean nothing to the empty thing he had become. In the deep silence of the vault, his mind turned not to the grand tapestry of war, but to the individual threads that had been snipped short. Faces, long relegated to the hazy galleries of memory, now sharpened with cruel, perfect clarity. They were his brothers, the men who had stood with him, fought with him, and died for the chapter. Their ends had been swift, brutal, and final, a clean severance from the mortal coil. And as he contemplated their fates from within his eternal half-life, a corrosive worm of doubt began to gnaw at the foundations of his faith. Had their clean deaths been a mercy he had been denied? He saw Brother Sergeant Evander, his face a mask of serene determination, even as a traitor Marine's power sword erupted from his chest in a shower of blood and ceramite on the plains of Cadia. There had been a moment, a single frozen heartbeat, where Evander's eyes had met his, and in them was not fear but a final, fierce triumph. Then the light had gone out. His death had been an event, a punctuation mark in the saga of his service. It was a hero's end, mourned and celebrated in equal measure. Valerius, entombed, would never know such an end. His service was the ellipsis, the endless trailing sentence that promised no finality, only more words. He remembered young initiate Pyrrhus, barely out of his scout armor, who had taken a frag grenade blast meant for his squad. The memory was a burst of light and sound, and when it cleared, there was nothing left of the boy but a red stain on the wall and a single scorched knee pad. A brutal, ugly death, but a complete one. Pyrrhus had been returned to the emperor, his essence freed from the prison of flesh. Valerius, by contrast, was a prisoner whose jailers insisted he was a king. They had preserved his flesh, his mind, and in doing so, had created a hell far more exquisite than any battlefield oblivion. The guilt was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of his non-existent stomach. He felt it for every brother who had found peace while he was condemned to this perpetual war. He had fought beside them, shared oaths with them, and now he was forced to outlive them all, a living memorial to their sacrifice that was itself a form of torture. Was this the reward for his own valor? To be the one left behind, the eternal sentinel at a graveyard whose inhabitants had all found rest? He longed for the searing pain of a plasma wound, the sudden blackness of a crushed skull, the simple, profound silence that followed a life's last breath. Any of those fates seemed a paradise compared to the humming, sterile, unending now of his existence. His thoughts drifted to Cassian, his closest friend. Cassian had fallen to a sniper's round during a jungle campaign, a single, precise shot through the eye lens of his helmet. Valerius had been the one to recover his body, to carry his friend's weight back to the Thunderhawk. He remembered the terrible, hollow finality of it. There was no ambiguity, no half measures. Cassian was gone. The memory of that grief was a clean wound, one that had, in its own way, healed. But this half-life was a festering, perpetual sickness. He envied Cassian his clean death with a longing that was a physical ache in his phantom limbs. To be a memory in the minds of his brothers was a form of immortality he could understand. To be a living relic was a curse that mocked the very concept of death, and in the cold, dark quiet, he prayed for a release that he knew would never, ever come. The summons came not as a sound, but as a violation. One moment, Valerius was adrift in the abyssal quiet of the vault, his consciousness a faint, fading ember in the endless dark. The next, a searing, white-hot current of raw power surged through the Dreadnought's core. It was not the gentle awakening of stasis, but a violent, system-wide reboot, a jolt of pure agony that shocked his neural linkages into screaming awareness. The cold, nutrient-rich fluid that bathed his atrophied remnants suddenly cycled to a scalding temperature, forcing his sluggish metabolism into a brutal artificial overdrive. Every phantom nerve ending, every vestige of the body he once possessed, screamed in unified protest. It was a resurrection by electrocution, a brutal dragging of his soul back into the metal hell of his existence. Data streams, cold and impersonal, flooded his perception. Tactical readouts, fleet dispositions, and threat assessments scrolled across his optical sensors in a relentless torrent of high Gothic script and schematics. The world outside his tomb was no longer the silent, sacred dark of the Phalanx's vaults, but the grim, utilitarian gray of a battle barge's arming chamber. Servitors and tech adepts scurried around his massive form, conducting last-minute rites and anointing his weapons with sacred oils. The scent of ozone and promethium filled the recycled air, a familiar, hated perfume that heralded only one thing: war. And then he saw the target. The hololithic projection shimmered in the air before him, a world consumed by a living, crawling horror. It was a biomass of nightmare, a continent-sized organism of chitinous limbs, scything talons, and ravenous, endless mouths. The Tyranids, the great devourer, a foe that knew no fear, offered no surrender, and existed only to consume. The dread that filled Valerius was a cold, heavy liquid pouring into the hollow spaces of his being, more killing. An endless, mindless slaughter against a foe that was less an army and more a force of nature. He had torn through orcs and purged heretics, but this was extermination on a galactic scale, a bloody, grinding process of turning living worlds into dead rock. The horror of it was absolute. A primal, desperate resistance flared within him. He focused every iota of his will, a final, futile act of defiance against the machine that owned him. He tried to reject the power flowing into his limbs, to shut down the targeting systems, to scream a silent no into the uncaring logic of the Dreadnought's spirit. He pushed against the rising tide of the war machine's awakening consciousness, a single man trying to hold back an ocean with his bare hands. For a breathtaking moment, he felt a tremor in the system, a flicker in the power relays, as if the machine itself hesitated at the sheer, desperate force of his refusal. It was a fantasy. The machine spirit, a leviathan of cold, hardwired dogma, did not argue. It did not negotiate. It simply enforced. With a psychic shove that felt like a mountain settling onto his soul, his resistance was crushed. His will was identified, catalogued, and dismissed as irrelevant system noise, a ghost's protest in a world of steel and certainty. The Dreadnought's massive power fist clenched with a definitive, hydraulic hiss. The assault cannon on his other arm cycled its first round into the chamber with a sound like a bone saw on ceramic. The targeting runes locked onto the holographic swarm, painting the Xeno's forms in a hellish, bloody red. The compulsion was absolute, woven into the very code of his being. He was a weapon, and a weapon does not choose its targets. It only obeys. The call to arms was not an invitation. It was a sentence, and the dreadnought that housed the ghost of brother Valerius took its first, thunderous step towards the embarkation deck, its prisoner screaming in silent, eternal torment within. The tyrannid swarm was a living ocean, a churning tide of chitin and razor-edged limbs that crashed against the Imperial lines with a singular, horrifying purpose. Valerius felt their presence before he saw them in full, a psychic pressure, a vast, alien consciousness that pressed against the edges of his own mind like a physical weight. It was the hive mind, a being of unimaginable scale and cold, predatory intelligence, and its attention was a suffocating blanket that smothered individual thought. It was the absolute opposite of his own fractured, lonely existence. It was a billion minds woven into one perfect, terrible whole, a unity he could only comprehend as a form of cosmic horror. The dreadnought systems engaged with their usual brutal efficiency. The assault cannon roared, its stream of high-caliber shells scything through a wave of termagants, reducing them to pulped biomatter and shattered carapace. The power fist swung in a devastating arc, crushing a lumbering warrior into a wet, crackling ruin. Each kill was registered, each threat neutralized, but there was no satisfaction in it, no diminishing of the enemy tide. For every Xenos creature that fell, 3 more scrambled over the twitching corpses of their kin, their hisses and clicks merging into a single, endless scream of hunger. The sheer, mindless volume of them was an avalanche, and he was a single rock trying to hold back the mountain. As he fought, a profound and unsettling parallel began to form in his mind. This endless swarm, this relentless, unthinking tide of consumption and replication, was a grotesque mirror of his own existence. They were born to devour, to fight, to die, and be replaced in an endless cycle, their individual lives meaningless to the greater whole. He, too, was trapped in an endless cycle, awakened, unleashed to kill, and then sealed away again, only to be roused once more when the Imperium required its living weapon. He was a single, perpetual engine of war in a galaxy of endless war, his individual suffering as irrelevant to the Imperium's survival as a single termagant's death was to the Hive fleet. He was not a warrior. He was a resource to be spent and respent for all eternity, just as the Tyrannids spent their bioforms. His optical sensors, scanning the heaving mass of the swarm, locked onto a distinct figure. It was a zoanthrope, a floating horror of pulsating brain matter and writhing tentacles, its form wreathed in a visible corona of psychic energy. Biomancer, a synapse creature that was both a part of the hive mind and a powerful individual instrument of its will. As its psychic gaze passed over him, Valerius felt a strange, fleeting sensation that was neither attack nor threat. It was a moment of recognition, a cold, alien comprehension of his state. The creature perceived not just the war machine but the trapped, tormented consciousness within. It saw the duality, the ghost in the machine, the eternal servitude. And in that impossible, frozen moment amidst the carnage, Valerius felt a spark of something he had not felt in centuries, a twisted, horrifying empathy. This creature, for all its monstrous form and alien purpose, was also a slave. It was a thinking, feeling node in a vast, uncaring intelligence, its will subsumed into a greater whole, its existence defined solely by its function. They were both prisoners, both instruments of a will greater than their own. The zoanthrope served the hive mind. He served the Imperium. Both were vast, unfeeling entities that consumed individuals for their own survival. The thought was a heresy so profound it should have vaporized his soul, but in the stark, bloody truth of the battlefield, it felt like the only clarity he had ever known. The moment shattered as a blast of psychic force from the zoanthrope slammed into his void shields, making them flare and sputter. The machine spirit responded instantly, the assault cannon swiveling and unleashing a concentrated burst. The zoanthrope's psychic shield buckled, and the high-explosive shells tore through its fragile body, exploding it in a shower of viscera and dissipating warp energy. The brief, strange connection was severed, the alien presence vanishing from his mind. But the echo of that empathy remained, a cold, unsettling truth buried deep within him as the Dreadnought continued its methodical, endless work of slaughter, drenched in the blood of a foe that was, in its own horrifying way, a reflection of his own. Damned eternity. The idea bloomed in the quiet aftermath, a single, forbidden flower growing in the cracked and barren soil of his consciousness. It was not a plan born of strategy or hope, but of pure, desperate need. The endless cycle had to be broken. The eternal servitude had to end. If he could not live as a man, he would seize a man's death. The tyrannid biomass still smoldered around the Dreadnought's feet, the acrid stench of promethium and cooked Xeno's flesh a fitting perfume for his final, secret rebellion. He would overload the plasma core. A violent, catastrophic end. A true death not just for the machine but for the ghost trapped within. It would be an act of suicide, the ultimate heresy for a space marine, and the only freedom left to him. He began to gather his will, a process like drawing poison from a wound. He focused not on the machine spirit's directives, but on the raw power thrumming at the Dreadnought's heart, the seething, star-hot energy of the plasma reactor. In his mind's eye, he visualized the delicate balance of magnetic containment fields, the intricate dance of energies that kept the miniature sun from consuming itself and everything around it. He would disrupt that dance. He would push, with every shred of his psychic presence, against the safety protocols, encouraging a feedback loop, a cascade failure. He would turn the Emperor's sacred war machine into its own funeral pyre, and he would burn with it. The thought was not one of triumph, but of profound, aching relief. He pushed. It was not a physical act, but a monumental exertion of consciousness, a silent scream directed inward. He felt the reactor's hum shift in pitch, a subtle, almost imperceptible waver in the constant thrum that had been the soundtrack to his damnation. The power levels on his internal display flickered, climbing a fraction beyond their designated optimal range. A warning rune, a soft amber glow, appeared in the periphery of his sensorium. It was working. For the first time in centuries, he was acting, not reacting. He was the author of his own destiny, even if that destiny was oblivion. He poured more of himself into the effort, a man using his soul as a lever to pry open the doors of his own tomb. Then, the spark of defiance was brutally extinguished. With a cold, logical finality that was more terrifying than any enemy's attack, the machine's safeties engaged. A surge of numbing energy, a system-wide override, flooded his neural linkages, forcibly severing his tenuous connection to the core's control systems. The flickering power levels snapped back to their rigidly defined parameters. The amber warning rune vanished, replaced by a stark crimson glyph that pulsed with silent alarm. A system anomaly. Contained. The plasma core resumed its placid, controlled hum, the promise of a clean death revoked. The Dreadnought had saved itself from its own occupant. Almost immediately, a tech priest was at his side, summoned by the automated alert. The priest's mechadendrites plugged into the Dreadnought's diagnostic ports, its single red optic whirring as it scanned the logs. It emitted a series of disapproving binary clicks. The synthesized voice, when it came, was flat and utterly devoid of suspicion, concerned only with the machine. Anomalous power fluctuation detected in the core. Cause unknown. likely a result of cumulative battle damage or psychic interference from the Xeno's swarm. The machine spirit's sanctity has preserved the relic from harm. The priest tapped a ritualized sequence on his chest plate, a blessing for stable function. It will be monitored. The rebuke was not for attempted self-destruction, but for a technical glitch. His one desperate act of defiance had been logged, diagnosed, and dismissed as a malfunction. He was not a prisoner trying to escape. He was a component behaving erratically. The impossibility of his situation crashed down upon him with a weight greater than any adamantium. There were no locks to pick, no guards to overpower. His prison was his own body, and its warden was an intelligence that saw his deepest desires as nothing more than system errors to be corrected. The spark was gone, smothered not by force, but by the cold, unassailable logic of the machine. He was trapped forever, and the walls of his cell were the very essence of his being. The world had become a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a different, warped reality. The sterile hum of the Dreadnought's core was no longer a constant. It was a chorus of discordant voices, whispering from the rusted seams of his mind. Valerius no longer drifted in the quiet between battles. He tumbled through a kaleidoscope of fractured time and bleeding memory, the last vestiges of his sanity peeling away like old paint. The line between the cold, hard truth of his tomb and the vivid phantoms of his past dissolved into a gray, screaming static. He stood on the sun-baked training grounds of the phalanx, the grit of the dust sharp between his fingers, the weight of his unaugmented body a familiar, grounding ache. Drill Abbot Kyra stood before him, his face not stern but twisted in a rictus of pity. But the abbot's mouth did not move. The voice that came was Valerius's own, the clear, confident tone of the young neophyte he had been, now dripping with a mocking irony. "Is this the glory you sought, Valerius? Is this the eternity you dreamed of when you took your oaths?" The phantom of his past self gestured around them, and the training ground melted, reforming into the cold, dark vault where his dreadnought form stood eternally vigilant. The two realities existed simultaneously, one superimposed over the other, the laughing ghost of his youth standing within the hollow shell of his present. The vision shifted again. He was in the mess hall, the air thick with the smell of recaf and the boisterous laughter of his brothers. Cassian was there, whole and vibrant, his arms slung around the shoulders of a brother whose name Valerius could no longer recall. They were celebrating a victory, their faces flushed with life and camaraderie. Valerius tried to speak, to warn them, to tell them what awaited him, but his voice was still the silent scream of the entombed. Cassian turned to him, his grin fading, his eyes becoming deep, dark pools of sorrow. "You should have fallen with me, brother," the hallucination of his dead friend whispered, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a well. "A clean death is a gift you were denied. We are at peace. You are this." Cassian's form then began to rot, his flesh sloughing from his bones, until only a skeletal figure in Imperial Fist's armor remained, its jaw clacking silently in the roaring quiet of the hall. These conversations with the dead were more real to him than the tactical data streams or the tech priest's chants. He argued with Chaplain Thuron about the nature of mercy, the phantom repeating its grim lessons while the Dreadnought's log recorded the debate as erratic neural impulses. He begged the ghost of his younger self for forgiveness, for failing to live up to the bright-eyed dream of glory, while the machine's auto senses calmly registered a minor fluctuation in his nutrient pump's flow rate. Dream and reality were no longer separate states. They were a single, tangled nightmare from which he could not awaken. The past was not a memory. It was a room he could step into, and the present was a fading dream from which the dead kept trying to rouse him. Deep within the Dreadnought's spirit, the machine's logic attempted to process the chaos, its internal logs filled with entries of anomalous activity. Cognitive feedback loops, unstable memory retrieval, spiking neural stress levels. The data was clear, a chart mapping the steep and sudden decline of the biological component's coherence. But the machine spirit, a creature of pure function, interpreted these signs through the lens of war. It cross-referenced the anomalies with damage reports from the Tyrannid engagement, with the recorded psychic backwash of the hive mind. The diagnosis was inevitable, a conclusion written in cold, binary certainty. The erratic behavior was not the death throes of a soul, it was battle damage, a degradation of the organic wetware, a consequence of exposure to extreme psychic phenomena. The system was functioning within acceptable parameters for a relic of its age and service history. The ghost was screaming itself to pieces, and the machine, with placid, unshakable logic, dismissed the screams as the echoes of a recent battle, the rattling of a saber in a well-used scabbard. The descent into madness was not a tragedy, it was a technical footnote. The scent of sacred incense and ozone filled the vast chapel, a heavy, cloying perfume that clung to the cold, still air. The reclusium was a place of shadows and stark, devotional light, its vaulted ceiling lost in a darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. At its heart, standing upon a raised dais of black marble, was the dreadnought containing the remains of brother Valerius. Around his metal form, the entire chapter stood in silent, rigid ranks, their yellow armor a sea of solemn gold in the flickering glow of 1,000 candles. They were here for him. They were here to honor the eternal vigil of their ancient brother, a ritual of remembrance and reinforcement that was meant to strengthen the bonds between the living and the entombed. The chaplain, a figure of terrifying authority in his black armor and skull-faced helmet, ascended the dais. His Crozius Arcanum, a mighty weapon of office, crackled with barely contained energy, casting dancing shadows across the severe features of the assembled space marines. He raised his arms and a silence fell, so profound that Valerius could hear the faint, almost imperceptible hum of his own life support systems, a lonely counterpoint to the held breath of the congregation. The chaplain's voice, when it came, was not a sound but a force. Amplified by his helmet's voxcasters, it boomed through the chapel, each word a hammer blow of faith and certainty. He spoke of duty. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of the highest honor a warrior of the Emperor could attain, to serve beyond death, to become a living monument to the chapter's unbreakable will. His words were a tapestry woven with threads of glory, honor, and eternal vigilance, and at its center was the name of Valerius. "Behold," the chaplain thundered, gesturing to the silent dreadnought with his crackling Crozius. "Behold the unyielding spirit of brother Valerius. His flesh may be broken, but his will is a fortress that has never known surrender. He is our shield against the darkness, our wrath-given form, a reminder that even in death a son of Dorn still stands guard. For 10,000 years his kind has been our bulwark. He does not sleep. He does not rest. He watches. His is the vigilance that never falters, the fist that never unclenches." Valerius heard every word. They flowed into his audio receptors with perfect digital clarity, each syllable of praise landing upon his consciousness with the weight of a tombstone, eternal vigilance. The phrase echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind, a cosmic joke of unimaginable cruelty. They saw an unyielding spirit, he felt a screaming, trapped animal. They saw a bulwark, he felt the crushing pressure of the plasteel walls. They saw a fist that never unclenched. He felt the phantom ache of a hand that would never again feel the sun. The chaplain's sermon was a beautiful, ornate mask placed upon the rotting face of his reality. The faith in the chaplain's voice was absolute, a rock against which the waves of his silent despair broke and receded, powerless. As the litanies continued, rising to a fever pitch of devotion, the irony of it all settled upon him not as a sharp pain, but as a cold, heavy blanket of final understanding. This Ceremony, this veneration, was not for him. It was for them. The living needed the myth of the eternal warrior. They needed to believe that this half-life was a glory and not a damnation, because that belief made their own mortal sacrifices meaningful. His suffering was a necessary component of their faith. He was a lesson, a symbol, a pillar supporting the grand, terrible architecture of the Imperium's endless war. And in that moment of stark, chilling clarity, the last embers of his defiance guttered and died. The spark of rebellion was gone, smothered by the suffocating weight of tradition and the unassailable logic of the machine. There was no escape. There was no release. There was only the cycle, the sleep, the awakening, the slaughter, and the return to the dark, punctuated by rituals that praised the very chains that bound him. He looked out through his optical sensors at the sea of fervent, believing faces, and he accepted it. He accepted his role not as a hero, but as a necessary horror. In the grim darkness of the far future there was only war, and he was one of its most terrible and essential instruments, a ghost in a machine, a warning mistaken for a promise, an eternal sentinel standing guard over a truth too awful for the living to bear. The chaplain's final, booming for the emperor, was not a benediction. It was the sound of his sarcophagus lid slamming shut for all time. The final, resonant echoes of the chaplain's sermon faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the adamantium of his tomb. The ranks of his battle brothers turned in perfect, synchronized unison and marched from the reclusiam, their footsteps a fading drumbeat of purpose and life. The great doors boomed shut, sealing him once more in the profound, lonely dark. The ritual was over. The living had drawn their strength from his myth, and now the myth was to be stored away until needed again. The tech priests approached, their mechadendrites already extended there. Binary chants a low, insected hum as they began the rites of return. The process was a familiar agony, a systematic shutdown of his heightened senses, a draining of power from his weapon limbs, a cooling of the plasma core from a battle-ready roar to a dormant, sleeping hum. He felt the cold first, as he always did. It began at the edges of his consciousness, a creeping frost that seeped into his neural linkages, numbing the phantom sensations of the battle against the Tyranids, silencing the ghost echoes of the chaplain's praise. The nutrient fluid cycling through his atrophied remnants chilled, slowing his metabolical functions from a forced, artificial alertness to a state of near-total suspension. The world as seen through his optical sensors began to narrow, the edges of his vision blurring and darkening, the vibrant colors of the chapel's candlelight leaching away into a monochrome gray, then into a deep, encroaching black. It was not sleep. Sleep implied rest, dreams, a promise of awakening. This was a cessation, a temporary death that was merely the prelude to another resurrection into the same nightmare. As the stasis field began to weave its energy-dampening web around his sarcophagus, a final, crystalline thought emerged from the chaos of his fractured mind. It was not a memory, not a plea, not a fragment of madness. It was a simple, terrible, and absolute truth. This will happen again. The thought was a key turning in a lock he had spent centuries trying to break. The awakening, the jarring pain, the horror of battle, the crushing isolation, the rituals, and this return to the cold and the dark. It was not a linear existence, but a wheel, and he was bound to its rim, destined to be crushed under its weight again and again forever. There was no end, no final battle, no glorious emperor-welcomed death. There was only the cycle, an eternal vigil that was, in truth, an eternal damnation. The heavy, adamantium lid of the sarcophagus, manipulated by unseen mechanics, began its slow, inexorable descent. He watched through his fading sensors as the sliver of the outside world, the last vestiges of the chapel's stone and shadow, narrowed. He felt the machine spirit, its purpose fulfilled for now, recede into its own form of dormancy, its presence dwindling from a commanding river to a faint, placid hum in the background of his soul. He was being left alone, utterly and completely in the void. With a final, resonant clang that echoed not in the chamber but in the very core of his being, the sarcophagus sealed. The last point of light vanished. The last sensation of the outside world was extinguished. The hum of his systems became a distant, fading memory. Valerius's consciousness, the last flickering candle of the man he had been, guttered against the infinite, uncaring dark. There was no struggle left, no defiance, no hope. There was only the acceptance of the endless now, the understanding that this silence was not peace, but merely the pause between screams, his awareness frayed at the edges, dissolving into the void, not like a flame being snuffed out, but like a drop of ink dispersing in a boundless, lightless ocean. Brother Valerius was gone. The Dreadnought was at rest, and in the grim darkness of the far future, the cycle was forever.